nice quiet. In my experience, it didn't always work. Welcome to all of you. It's going to be a fabulous day, and from my point of view, I can relax a bit because all these things. The actor for this later this afternoon will be coming later on in the morning, and he'll be rehearsing. So if you see somebody walking across, hopefully into the room there to do a bit of rehearsing before this afternoon's session, there we will be smoking. But Clare is a philosopher, really. She's a professor of philosophy at King's College London. Did your interest in George Eliot come through George Eliot's interest in philosophy?
It did, yes. Her translation of Spinoza was the entry point.
Wonderful. And there are copies of Clare's book available, of course, £5 discount if you buy it here today, and Clare, I'm sure, will happily sign it for you. But that's for later. We're fairly strict timetable if we can keep to it this morning. Clare has an hour, and then there's a sort of 10-minute, quarter of an hour break. Not really for drinks, because if we say drinks and be back in a quarter of an hour, people never are. And so it's a comfort break. I should have mentioned the toilets, but it's the door down, the first door this side of the kitchen, and there's a sign on the top that says toilets. It's a clue. That's an hour, and then Kathy will take over at 11:45, and then 1:45 we can relax a bit more because it's lunch for those who booked it. And it's a lovely day. Last year it was a lovely day, and people disappeared from this room. They decanted and they all perched or sat on the playground, the old school playground. There are 2 tables out there which we can put up so that if people want to do that and enjoy the sunshine, that will be fine. So, without more ado, Clare, just fascinated by what you're going to say. It'll be wonderful. So, over to you. Thank you, Clare.
Thank you so much, Joel, for inviting me to give this talk. It's such a pleasure to be here in Nuneaton, just walking from the station today. I had the sense of being very close to the source, thinking about George Eliot as I walked along the river. So it's just a delight to be here after spending the last 3.5 years or so very much immersed in George Eliot, the woman, and George Eliot's amazing writings. So as John said, I'm a philosopher by trade, so to speak, and I became interested in George Eliot because Spinoza is one of my favourite philosophers. And then many years ago, I happened to see on the shelf in the library George Eliot's translation of Spinoza, which was hardly available at all, which is a very limited edition. And I was seeing this and thinking, oh, George Eliot and Spinoza. So I'd read a couple of George Eliot's novels, mostly my English A-level, but I didn't realise that she was such a philosophical thinker. So that made me go back and reread the novels I'd already read and read the other ones I hadn't yet read, and saw that there was so much philosophy in these books. And so I became obsessed with George Eliot, particularly because there aren't very many women in the philosophical tradition in the canon. So when you study philosophy, you just read all these books by men, which are wonderful books, but it was so nice to find a female philosopher in the 19th century who I didn't even realise was a philosopher. And I ended up writing this biography, and it's the second biography I've written. I wrote a biography of Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who I did my PhD on. And when I wrote that first biography, I thought a lot about how biography itself is a really philosophical genre. You start thinking about the meaning of life, or the truth of a human life, or what it is to understand another person. So for me, it raised all these quite deep philosophical questions. So biography seems to be a really good medium for thinking about George Eliot's philosophy, not least because her philosophical thinking was also in these narrative books. You know, so she philosophized through writing about people, writing about human experience, telling stories. So in a way, the kind of philosophy George Eliot is doing in her novels lends itself, I think, to that narrative form of biography. And I also had become really interested in marriage, again as a philosophical theme that doesn't often get treated as a philosophical question in the history of philosophy. I comment at the beginning of the book that most of the male philosophers I read at university were unmarried men who didn't have much to say about marriage or didn't have any experience of marriage, or maybe even thought that marriage is a kind of hindrance to philosophy, it's just something trivial and domestic, it's not serious, whereas partly through thinking about Kierkegaard, actually, who also had a very complicated relationship to the marriage question, again I started to think that that's a kind of site of human experience that we can all relate to, whether we're married or unmarried. Most of us at least grew up inside a marriage, or even if our parents weren't married, that would be an issue too, wouldn't it? So that, you know, whatever our relationship to marriage, it's something that really, I think, touches all our lives and shapes our experience in different ways, and it raises questions about freedom and choice and identity and happiness and morality, you know, all sorts of philosophical questions. So anyway, all this converged in this book about George Eliot, which came out just at the end of March, so a couple of months ago now. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of the themes of the book. I mean, there's so much to say, obviously, I wrote a whole book about it. So I can only really scratch the surface, but I'm hoping to leave lots of time for questions so that you can ask me or tell me what you think about the themes, about George Eliot and so on. So I want to start with this letter, which George Eliot wrote, well, she wasn't yet George Eliot then, she wrote it in 1856. So this was 2 years into her relationship with George Henry Lewis, the man she called her husband but couldn't be legally married to. So they got together in 1854. This was written 2 years later, just a few months before Marion Evans, or Marion Lewis, wrote her first story and became George Eliot. And this letter was, I think, only discovered relatively recently. It's not in Gordon Hayes' edition of the letters. And as you can see, or as you will see, this letter inspired the title of my book, because the subtitle is George Eliot's Double Life. And here she uses that phrase, double life. Thank you, dear Cara, for your sweet letter, which was really something my soul thirsted for. I know writing is a tax, but even a line or two now and then from your own self will seem something added to my life. I think we are nearer to each other than we could ever have been before, for I am able to enter into your feelings and understand your life so much better. It is a great experience, this marriage, and all one's notions of things before seem like the reading of a mystic inscription without the key. I can't tell you how happy I am in this double life, which helps me to feel and think with double strength. I shouldn't say these things unless I loved you very dearly, which I do. Ever your old, yet new, Marion. So it's amazing really how much there is in this letter and how much there is to say about it. Marion wrote this letter when she was really in exile, in a general sense. You know, because of her relationship with Lewis, she'd been ostracised from society. People no longer came to visit her. Her old friends didn't invite her to go and see them anymore. So she was really isolated, and she was also specifically isolated from her friend Cara, who was a really close friend to her, had been a very close friend during the last 15 years, almost like a sister to her. And and the friendship between Marion and Cara was really sort of tested and ruptured when Marion got together with Lewis. So this is just when they are beginning to kind of reconcile. Cara has written her a nice letter, and so at the beginning we get this sense of a real gratitude for this letter, a sense of being let back in to the friendship. But also I think we still get a sense of Marion's loneliness and her isolation. She talks about thirst, her soul is thirsty for this contact with her old friend. So there's a real emotional range in this letter, the loneliness, the thirst for friendship. But then in this last paragraph she talks about her happiness. She's so happy in the relationship. So there's a kind of joy and exuberance there, but also sadness, which I guess mirrors the kind of emotional range that we're used to in George Eliot's novels too. It's rarely one or the other, usually the whole range of human experience. When she talks about double life and uses this phrase to describe the relationship, she's invoking this shared world, a sense of two-ness but also oneness. I thought this was such a striking phrase to use about marriage, double life. In taking it for the subtitle of my book, I was also playing on a kind of another sense of double life, which is the fact that she was at least two people. She was Marion Evans Lewis, the wife, the woman, and of course she was George Eliot. And the struggle of living this double life and the way that took shape and changed and unfolded over the course of her career as George Eliot is another theme, of course, that I've explored in the book. And then another phrase which I think is really striking and telling here is when she talks about this relationship helping her to feel and think with double strength. And this idea of thought and feeling kind of coming together, the question of how to combine thought and feeling, for me is absolutely at the heart of George Eliot's experience as a woman, and also her work as an artist and as a philosopher. How to bring together thought and feeling, the emotional aspects of our life, and then the intellectual aspects. Of course, she was a very intellectual person, just incredibly knowledgeable and just, sort of fiercely intellectual. And she taught herself so much about the history of philosophy and religion and science and so on. So she was such an intellectual person, but she was also a very sensitive and quite turbulent, emotional person too. So the task of kind of how to balance and how to bring together and live out these two sides of her nature, I think, is really interesting. And also in her novels, I've mentioned that I see these novels as really very philosophical. And so she's, rather than just writing about ideas, rather than staying on that intellectual level of arguments and concepts, which is often what philosophy is imagined to be, and certainly in our academic culture, in the philosophy department, that's the kind of writing that most people do in the name of philosophy, very conceptual. But for George Eliot, she's thinking about how to integrate thought and feeling in philosophy too, by thinking about how philosophical questions and ideas arise in the midst of human life, in experience, are kind of clothed with feeling. And this phrase, thought and feeling, or feel and think, the conjunction of these two comes up quite a lot in her writing, both in her letters and also in her novels. I think it's towards the end of Middlemarch, Dorothea says to Celia, "You would have to feel with me, else you would never know." Celia's curious at this point about how on earth Dorothea got together with Ladislaw, and she wants to find out the story And this is what Dorothea says, you would have to feel with me, else you would never know. So this idea that knowledge, isn't just something intellectual, it involves a kind of fellow feeling with somebody. And I take that remark that Dorothea makes to Celia as also George Eliot talking to us, the reader. You know, you have to feel with me, else you will never know. And then, in the middle paragraph of this letter, so interesting that Eliot here is defining marriage or categorizing marriage as an experience. It is a great experience, this marriage. And in doing this, she's wresting the concept of marriage from the grip of both church and state. So she's saying, you know, marriage is neither, well, she's not saying this, but we can infer from this that marriage is not a matter of a religious sacrament, nor is it a legal contract. Rather, it's an experience. And in defining marriage as this way, as an experience, Marion is claiming her right to this concept, marriage, which of course she couldn't claim to it if it was a legal matter or a kind of church-sanctioned matter. So in a way she's presenting herself as Cara's equal here. She's talking about an experience that they both share, the experience of marriage. Whereas when we define marriage in other ways, then she and Cara are sort of held apart, you know, because she's marries the person who's transgressed marriage and who isn't legally married, whereas Cara is the legitimate wife. But by defining it in this way, she's able to find a space where they can both stand together. And then this experience of marriage will become the subject matter of George Eliot's fiction. I've already hinted at how this itself is an experience that gives rise to philosophical questions. And the way Eliot treats marriage is so different from the way many other writers, certainly of her time, treated it. The experience of marriage in George Eliot's novels is very varied, complex, often quite dark, frequently an ambiguous experience. And then finally, in this letter, there's a kind of image of marriage as an initiation, so being brought into some kind of secret, some kind of new way of being. So she has this metaphor here of, you know, all her ideas before entering into this experience of marriage seemed like trying to read a mystic inscription without the key. So just looking at something and not being able to understand it, not being able to interpret it. Now she has this special key that can unlock the secret experience of marriage. Now she's been let inside. And of course, she had previously been locked out of marriage. During her 20s, she was hoping to marry and had been unable to do so. And even when she did find a man who wanted to live with her and be with her and who loved her, she remained, in one sense, locked out of that experience. And she was still, as I said, shut out of society when she wrote this letter. So there's so much in here that really opens up the marriage question, as I call it in the book. I just want to say a little bit about the broader context, the significance of marriage in Victorian England, so the kind of culture around marriage that George Eliot inherited. Really important thing here is romanticism, romantic poetry and art that started to flourish at the beginning of the 19th century. And George Eliot, you know, as a girl, grew up with romantic literature, reading Walter Scott's novels, for example, Wordsworth's poetry, and she dramatises that experience of reading romantic literature in the middle of the plot, because Maggie also discovers this whole world of art and music and so on, which really kind of moves her in an emotional way. Romanticism, I guess in a way the clue being in the name, places a lot of emphasis on romantic love, elevates romantic love as a kind of spiritual experience. At the same time, many of the romantics also challenged traditional morality, including marriage morality, ideas about the traditional family structure and so on. So some of the romantics experimented with free love and extramarital relationships or open relationships, all this kind of thing. So that was a key influence on the meaning of marriage in Victorian Britain. Alongside that, the decline of traditional Christian faith. People, not everybody, in fact a minority of people, but some intellectuals and scientists, including prominently George Eliot, were questioning religious faith, Christian belief, the authority of the Anglican Church, and so on. And in this atmosphere where there's a real unsettling of traditional beliefs and values, marital piety and devotion often become a kind of replacement for religious piety and devotion. So even if belief in God and the traditional doctrines was kind of crumbling, there was still a sense that marriage provided a kind of sort of anchor and a sense of certainty, something that we could still believe in, even if the traditional beliefs were no longer accessible. And this part of this very famous poem by Matthew Arnold called Dover Beach, which is often seen as just epitomising the loss of faith in Victorian England. He actually wrote this poem on his honeymoon when he was about to get married to this lady, and at the end of the poem he says, "Our love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here, as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night." So he's evoking, in a way, quite a dark and frightening and disorienting sense of sort of cultural shift of no longer, and a disillusion, I guess. The world which seemed to be so beautiful actually is empty of these values that traditional Christian belief had secured for it. But what he says at the beginning there is that even if those values are no longer available, they can be true to one another. So there's a sense that this is this kind of truth, the fidelity between two people, the devotion between two people, as I said before, can be one kind of truth, one kind of certainty in a world where other sorts of truth seem to be unsettled and kind of much more fluid than they had previously been. So, I mean, that's obviously very much from a male perspective. Another dimension of thinking about marriage at this time was Barbara Lee Smith. So she became Barbara Bodichon, and she was one of George Eliot's best friends, if not her closest friend, certainly during the latter half of Eliot's life, after she'd been a bit estranged from Cara Gray and Cara's sister, Sarah Hennell. But Barbara Lee Smith, as she was when she wrote this 1854 pamphlet, was a radical feminist, an activist, and she wrote this pamphlet called A Brief Summary in Plain Language of the Most Important Laws Concerning Women. And here she paints a very different picture of marriage, much less romantic than Matthew Arnold or the poets. And she talks about how marriage is really not a very advantageous state for a woman to be in at all. So once a woman gets married, she wrote, her body belongs to her husband, she is in his custody. A woman of 21 becomes an independent human creature, but if she unites herself to a man, she gets married, she finds herself legislated for, and her condition of life suddenly and entirely changed. Whatever age she may be, she is again considered as an infant. Having been courted and wedded as an angel, a wife is denied the dignity of a rational and moral being ever after. So it's really interesting to see these radical ideas intertwining with still a very romantic ideal of marriage. And I mean, Barbara did get married herself. So this is another aspect of the whole landscape of the marriage question in George Eliot's culture. And I mean, Barbara Beauchamp is really a heroine, certainly in my book, in my sense of Eliot's story. I mean, she stuck by Marion when she got together with Lewis, when most people didn't. She was also the first person to guess that her friend Marion was actually George Eliot, author of Adam Bede, and it was such a joyful moment for Marion to receive this letter from Barbara, and she suddenly felt recognised and seen when she'd had a real sort of struggle with you know, I mean, she thought, at first she thought anonymity was a really great idea, but then when she became so successful, she realised that it had its downside, which is that she couldn't really get any credit for all this work she'd done. And so to get that recognition from her friend Barbara, who really saw that only she could have written these books, was just a sort of joyful moment for her. As you probably know, I mean, George Eliot couldn't go to university, Marion Evans couldn't go to university. Women weren't allowed to study at universities until really the 1860s, end of the 1860s. And it was Barbara Beauchamp, in fact, who worked with her friend Emily Davies to found the first college for women in Cambridge, which they opened it in 1869. It was just in this rented house and had 5 students. So she was really a pioneer of education for women. But even so, it was such a long road. I mean, women still weren't actually able to receive degrees from Cambridge University until 1948. Incredible, really, to think about. And it was again at the end of the 1860s, 1870s. Universities, London universities were also opening up to women. So this was a time when Eliot was writing her novels, when higher education was, on the one hand, largely denied to women, but it was just beginning to open up to them. And it's interesting to reflect on how the marriage question was part of this whole shifting culture around intellectual life in Britain. So not only were women expected to devote themselves to family life, to be wives and mothers, not philosophers, not scholars, but actually also for men too, the scholarly life was seen as a kind of alternative to marriage. It was framed as a kind of monastic vocation that required the sacrifice of family life. So until the 1860s, Oxford and Cambridge colleges didn't allow fellows to have wives. So not only could women not go to university, but men couldn't have wives if they were going to be fellows of Oxford and Cambridge colleges. So, and as I say, this started to shift at the end of the 1860s. So in a way, this is a kind of it's symbolic, I think, of what I was saying before, the fact that traditionally in philosophy, marriage is not considered a site for intellectual growth, for philosophical work, for thinking, for deep thinking. It's seen as actually a hindrance and something that's a completely separate domain. And what is so striking about George Eliot is that she completely changes that and treats the marriage experience, the very varied marriage experience, that is an experience, of course, that both men and women have, she treats that experience as a site for, well, the growth of wisdom, the pursuit of wisdom, which is what philosophy is. So I just want to give you one example of this. There's so much to say about all this, and a lot of it's in the book. But just thinking about Middlemarch, and which is such a philosophical novel. And I mean, the chapter on Middlemarch in my book was the one I was most scared of writing, partly because Middlemarch is many people's very favourite book. It's almost like a Bible for some people. It's this book that they return to and reread again and again. So I felt quite terrified of saying anything about it because it's almost like a sacred text for people. So that was one thing. But also, there's been so much written about Middlemarch, in terms of academic literary scholarship. And not being a literary scholar myself, I thought, what on earth can I say about Middlemarch that hasn't already been said? Anyway, so it's very, very, very daunted. But in the end, I found a path through that chapter and managed to write it. And discovered that there's just so much philosophy in Middlemarch. And I put some of those ideas in the chapter on a novel in the book. So this is just one small aspect of that, really. Anyway, this is Dorothea and poor Casaubon, who is destined to be this quite pathetic figure in our own sort of cultural history. And it's comedy in a way, isn't it? Seeing Dorothea fall for this man in such a disillusioned, naive way. But this is Dorothea thinking about what it would be like to get married to Casaubon. Here was a man who could understand the higher inward life, and with whom there could be some spiritual communion, nay, who could illuminate principle with the widest knowledge, a man whose learning almost amounted to a proof of whatever he believed. He thinks with me, said Dorothea to herself, or rather he thinks the whole world of which my thought is but a poor two-penny mirror. And his feelings too, his whole experience, what a lake compared to my little pool. It would be my duty to study, that I might help him the better in his great works. There will be nothing trivial about our lives. Everyday things with us would mean the greatest things. It would be like marrying Pascal. I should learn to see, as a great philosopher, I should learn to see the truth by the same light as great men have seen it. And then I should know what to do when I was older. I should see how it was possible to live a grand life here, now, in England. So it's very sweet, really, isn't it? But we see here Dorothea's her philosophical ambitions. She wants to learn to see the truth by the same light as great men have seen it by. She talks about the widest knowledge. So she's got a real yearning for knowledge, for wisdom, for truth. This is, in a way, the philosophical temperament. To want to explore, to want to seek, to understand, to gain knowledge and so on. And because Dorothea doesn't have the opportunity to go to university, study philosophy, learn Latin, where all these kinds of things, she doesn't have access to that kind of whole intellectual world. And so she thinks that the only path to it is by marriage to this man who she takes to be some kind of great philosopher, and she compares him with Augustine and Pascal and so on. Of course, as we know, it doesn't turn out the way she hopes. There's a passage a bit later where really the language is actually very, very similar to the language here, but it talks about how once she's actually living with Casaubon, she realises this lake that she imagined is just a very small pool, a bit like her own small pool that she was trying to escape by getting out of it. And she talks about how it's actually a bit like being in an enclosed basin, so this very small area that you see Casaubon is kind of circling around, doing this quite futile, very dry, scholarly work. He's kind of deluded about his own work and so on. So this turns out to be a very disillusioned hope that Dorothea has, and yet there's a real irony, I think, here, in that, in fact, marriage to Casaubon does actually is a route to wisdom for Dorothea, but not in the way she'd expected. So she expects that Casaubon's great wisdom and knowledge is going to somehow be sort of transmitted to her and she's going to share in it. Actually, what happens is that she is forced by the difficulties of that relationship to grow in a, yes, partly in an intellectual way, but also emotionally, spiritually. She actually does find wisdom, but not the kind of wisdom she was hoping for. Instead, it's the kind of wisdom that marries thought and feeling, as I was suggesting earlier, this expanded sense of what philosophy might be. That's to do with emotional intelligence. It also has a really strong ethical kind of core. It's not just theoretical knowing or understanding, it's knowing what to do. Actually, it's interesting that it's there when she talks about her aspirations right at the end of the passage. She says, then I should know what to do. So she's seeking a kind of knowledge that isn't just theoretical, it's going to help her ethically, it's going to help her know how to live. And in fact, as I say, she does gain this knowledge, but not in the way that she expected. So this is from much further on in the book. She has interrupted Will Ladislaw and Rosamond Lydgate having their little kind of flirtatious scene together. And Dorothea's, I think she's gone to visit Rosamond, I think, to talk to her, to help her, because she knows that there are these problems. She's discovered that Rosamond and Lydgate are having these problems in their marriage. So she goes on this very well-meaning errand to visit Rosamond, and then walks in and sees Rosamond huddled up with Ladislaw. So this is what she sees when she enters the room. And she's very jealous. She's very jealous when she sees Ladislaw with Rosamond. And she has a kind of dark night of the soul following this episode, and she stays up, she can't sleep. She's got all these kind of raging emotions of jealousy, and she's sort of devastated, and she's really in this very emotionally very tumultuous state all through the night. And then there's a kind of shift, kind of moral shift that happens in her. And this is how George Eliot describes it. She, Dorothea, began now to live through that yesterday morning, the visit to Rosamond's house, deliberately again, forcing herself to dwell on every detail of its possible meaning. Was she alone in that scene? Was it her event only? She forced herself to think of it as bound up with another woman's life. In her first outleap of jealous indignation, she had enveloped both Will and Rosamond in her burning scorn. We're told much earlier that Dorothea has this scorching quality in her, the kind of scorn is scorching. And it seemed to her as if Rosamond were burned out of her sight forever. But that base prompting, which makes a woman more cruel to a rival, to another woman, than to her faithless lover, could have no strength of recurrence in Dorothea, when the dominant spirit of justice within her had once overcome the tumult, the emotional tumult, and had once shown her the truer measure of things. So she sees things more truly. All the active thought with which she had before been representing to herself the trials of Lydgate's lot, and this young marriage union which, like her own, seemed to have its hidden as well as evident troubles. All this vivid, sympathetic experience returned to her now as a power. It asserted itself, as a quiet knowledge asserts itself, and will not let us see as we saw in the day of our ignorance. So what a more beautiful and powerful passage, isn't it? So here, again, these philosophical themes, she's able to see things more truly, and also to overcome her own very self-centered emotional experience. It's not her event only. She's able to think about Rosamond, this woman that she's, in a way, she kind of is hating her because of the jealousy. But it's her own troubles in her own marriage that really help her to connect emotionally and actually empower her. All this vivid, sympathetic experience returned to her now as a power. It asserted herself as acquired knowledge, asserts herself. So she has actually acquired knowledge through her relationship with Casaubon. And will not let us see as we saw in the day of Arena. So there's been a transition from ignorance to wisdom, which is the philosophical path. But as I say, it doesn't come in the way Dorothea had hoped. So that's just one example of the kinds of philosophical ideas that we can draw from George Eliot's fiction. It shows how she's doing philosophy in such a human way, such an emotionally intuitive and intelligent way, and perhaps we might say in a distinctively feminine way. So what about George Eliot's own experience of marriage? What about her relationship with George Lewis? So this, of course, is part of the biography as well, trying to, in a way, step inside this experience of marriage that she wrote about to Cara Bray. We saw how in the letter to Cara, she was extremely positive about that experience. She talks about how happy she is with Lewis, and she's, they certainly were, I think, very, very happy in the sense of being very devoted to each other. But that kind of happiness, of course, is not the whole story, partly because we also know that George Eliot was quite depressed a lot at the time and often very frustrated by her work and all sorts of things. She had quite a melancholy temperament. And so, of course, I was curious to know about the experience of marriage that they shared. And in many ways, that experience is inaccessible to us. She described it in a way that was pretty much always extremely positive, in a way almost idealised. She always talked about how perfectly happy they were together. And I suppose I was interested in the complexity underlying those descriptions, because no relationship is perfect. No relationship is perfect. Certainly not a relationship that lasts for more than 20 years. You might, get a 2-month relationship that's perfect, but not over the long term. Of course, we all know that there are going to be challenges and tensions and difficulties that any couple are going to face. So you may be familiar with this book, really influential book written in 1983, Parallel Lives, by this literary critic, Phyllis Rose, and she talked about 5 Victorian marriages: Ruskin, Charles Dickens, John Stuart Mill, and George Eliot and Lewis. And George Eliot and Lewis, their relationship is the one that emerges from this book as the only happy marriage. So Phyllis Rose talks about these other marriages are all in different, Thomas Carlyle and Jane Carlyle, that's the other one. They're all kind of very difficult marriages, often, and the wives are quite mistreated in these relationships. And then the George Eliot and Lewis emerge from this book as like this very happy couple, and there's a sense that perhaps this is because they weren't actually legally married, and so they had a bit more freedom. This was a love relationship. They weren't weighed down by the kind of machinery of institutional marriage. I mean, Phyllis Rose was really a second wave feminist, so the narrative, George Eliot's own narrative about their perfect relationship, in a way really suited Phyllis Rose's feminist agenda in the 1980s. George Eliot is this woman who's having it all. She's got this really happy marriage, she's got fulfilling work, she's making lots of money. That's the kind of ideal. So Phyllis Rose and actually most other biographers have just tended to, I think, in some ways, uncritically embraced the very idealised image of George Eliot's marriage that Eliot herself put forward. And I wanted to question that in the book for various reasons, which I can talk about if you want to later when we have questions. So one thing that I think encourages us to rummage beneath that quite glossy, perfect surface is the way that Eliot in her novels quite consistently talks about the way couples actually have a kind of duty to hide their relationships from other people. That's part of what it is to be loyal or faithful to your spouse, your husband or wife. So you don't tell everybody about the problems you're having. You don't tell your friends about the arguments. There's a sense that all this has to be kept behind closed doors, sort of for the sake of the marriage, and that's the kind of duty that we owe to our partners. And also, she talks quite a lot about pride. So there's this idea that a happy marriage, a happy relationship is success. And that if we can project an image of a happy marriage, then that's kind of we're showing ourselves to be living, successful lives. And so there's lots of reasons why couples would hide their difficulties from the world. So these are just a couple of quotations. The first one from Middlemarch. We mortals, men and women, devour many a disappointment between breakfast and dinner time. Keep back the tears, look a little pale about the lips, and in answers to inquiries say, oh, nothing. Pride helps us, and pride is not a bad thing when it only urges us to hide our own hurts and not to hurt others. And then in Daniel Deronda, there's this sense that Gwendolen would be really humiliated if everyone knew what an awful time she was having with her husband. In disclosure of disappointment or sorrow, she saw nothing but a humiliation, which would have been vinegar to her wounds. So she wants to keep it hidden. Same with Romola. Romola also, we hear about how she keeps the sorrow of her and the disappointment. I mean, disappointment is the word that is there in both of those quotations. It's the deep disappointment that Romola experiences too when she gets married to this man he's gorgeous, he's lovely, he's seems so perfect, romantic, and then the experience of that relationship is so different, and she's just utterly devastated and betrayed by it. And in many ways, it's her own hopes and expectations as a part of the cause of that disappointment. So of course we don't know exactly what Eliot and Lewis kept hidden from the world. There are a few clues to some of the difficulties they faced, which I tease out in the book. For example, even nowadays, a woman who is much more successful professionally than her husband and earns lots more money, that can be a challenging thing for both partners in a relationship because of cultural norms around, what success is for a man. So that's certainly a challenge they faced. And there are moments where Lewis perhaps responds to that kind of power imbalance with an assertion of control. He could be quite controlling of Eliot's work in ways that could be perceived as protective and supportive. It's quite ambiguous, but also there are moments where perhaps it crosses a line into something a bit darker, or at least something that perhaps Eliot herself found kind of an ambiguous experience. This is a recent edition of Paradise. It's reissued a couple of years ago with an introduction by Sheila Hetty, who is a novelist, a contemporary novelist, Canadian novelist, whose work I really like. And she's very philosophical. Anyway, I was really happy that she wrote the intro to this new edition of Paradise. It's an interesting essay that she's got there. But she talks about the way imagination plays a role in any relationship, and she quotes her grandmother here, Sheila Hetty. My grandmother once said to my uncle, speaking of marriage, sex is the glue, it's what keeps it together. Rose's point seems to be imagination is the glue. Which is really interesting, isn't it? Really interesting way to think about relationships and how the way partners imagine one another, how that's part of the meaning of the relationship. And it's also when we're thinking about other people's relationships, and it strikes me how curious we tend to be about other people's private lives, particularly, you know many couples, but we don't really know what's sort of going on. We see the public face, and I think we have a natural curiosity about other people's relationships, and often we sort of have there's lots of imaginative work that goes into interpreting what another person's marriage is like. And certainly that's part of the work of biography. Biography is an interesting genre because on the one hand, it's really important to be true to the facts. So there's very much an empirical element of historical accuracy when you're writing a biography. But it's also an imaginative work because we're trying to think about how the person's feeling. So there's a sort of empathy and imagination that goes with the more historical aspects of writing a biography. And again, it's sort of thought and feeling mixed together in trying to understand another person and trying to tell the story of their life. So, of course, there are imaginative elements in my book, decisions I made, interpretations I made, that other readers might not share or agree with. They may imagine it differently, which of course is fine. As you may know, the letters that George Eliot and Lewis exchanged were buried with them in Highgate Cemetery. So in a sense, we will never know that experience of marriage, that inner truth that they shared, their double life. And yet, it's impossible not to try to imagine it. But what's so wonderful about the novels is that we kind of break through that buried secret, and we get to see into the interior of another couple's marriage. We get to see into the shared life, something that's normally concealed, something that's normally hidden, normally buried. So I'll stop there, and hopefully there'll be some time for some questions. Thank you.
I'm sure there are questions. Anybody who'd like to start the ball rolling?
Yeah. I've read the book, really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And I was just wondering, they wanted to sort of put on a good front for the public, but I was just wondering, I don't think George Eliot was that bothered because of the absences. He used to. The thing that I read was when he was going to visit his friend Lyle House for 2 weeks over Christmas. He just left it. And I'm thinking, well, how's that going to be seen by the... But I think it was while he was away, we were about him censoring the letters and that, but she opened letters from Blackwood that was addressed to Lewis, and she opened it, and then I think Blackwood had said, write to me personally, so she wrote back to him.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think what's really fascinating is the way Lewis sort of, the way Eliot negotiates that relationship with Blackwood, her editor and publisher. Lewis is very involved in that. Most of the time he is really like the agent who mediates that relationship. And there are also times where Eliot. It's just really interesting the way as a couple they can navigate that. It's like a three-way relationship, isn't it, between Eliot and Lewis and the publisher?
Yeah.
And it's evolved. It's a long, again, it's like a 20-year relationship. It evolves over time.
It's good that it came back after Roman.
Yes, I know, yeah.
Yes.
It just strikes me now in novels. It's the people, the marriages that work is where the illusions are stripped away.
Yes.
Like Fred and Mary, there were no, in Middlemarch,
Yes.
no illusions about each other at all. I suppose, you're about to have him be when he managed diner, well, he's had to sort of face reality but painfully.
Yes.
That's whereas the others, where they have expectations, it just goes awfully wrong,
It's definitely an argument for getting them to know someone quite well before marrying. The experience of people in the book who don't, they don't, obviously people couldn't live together before they got married. That wouldn't have been acceptable. So people have really quite limited opportunities to spend time together, whereas, as you say, Fred and Mary, they're friends since they were little children, so they really have the chance to spend lots of time together and get to know each other without a lot of romantic apparatus around it. Yeah.
Carol, we want to...
Yeah. George Eliot, in the marriage question, didn't she ever write about the marriage of George Eliot to his wife and the mother of his 4 children?
That's another
It was a
aspect.
very strange marriage because he'd got children already and she had 4 more by his best friend.
I know. Well, she didn't. I mean, she didn't write about it.
Never wrote about it.
Not directly. I mean, I think themes from that situation do come into the novels. The idea of the other woman and children from a previous relationship. You think of Daniel Deronda, Grandcourt has this. I mean, they weren't married, but he has a woman with whom he had these children. Anyway, so I think it's the themes creep in, but she certainly...
It's interesting to hear the thoughts of his wife.
I know, I wish there was more.
What about her?
I wish there was more evidence of what she thought.
What she was thinking.
Yes, yeah. I think, again, we'll never know. Yeah.
Thank you, I found that very interesting, particularly as I'm more of a specialist on Dickens than anybody about a particularly interesting marriage.
Yes.
But you sometimes reach the opposing view that was portrayed of the married wife being hanging over her body and her husband owning everything. There was a quite aggressive harridans in literature who ruled their husbands over the 19th century literature.
Yes.
But I've got an elephant in the room to me. His name's Johnny Cross. I wondered if there's any kind of philosophical approach that you can possibly make to that very, very strange real marriage.
Yes. Well, I give my view of it in the book. But on the first question, I think that's so important that this kind of the theme of domination in marriage is pretty gendered until I think we get to Felix Holt. So it's always think of Janet Repentant, the wife who's abused by the husband. In Felix Holt, she flips it, and it's the woman who bullies her husband and just makes him completely. She sort of destroys him basically, and then we see that again in the Lydgate marriage where Rosamond, she seems so sweet and docile, but actually she's got this kind of iron, will, and she completely, again, just kind of oppresses her husband. So it's really good that she doesn't just have it as a gendered thing, that it's always the women who are victimised, and that she will show. It's much more complex than that, as you say. It can be just as much the other way around. Yeah. I don't have time to go into my reading of the John Cross marriage, but as I say, I do venture on it. But yeah.
David.
During their time together, in 25 years, there seems to be a gradual evolution from social ostracism to a degree of social acceptance.
Yes.
And I wonder if you think that made any difference in the way the marriage evolved.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not just acceptance. They became a celebrity couple, that people flocked to their house. It's ironic, isn't it, that they were, she was unvisited, and then they got to the stage where people were kind of clamouring to visit her and, coming to the Priory on Sunday afternoons, and she had this kind of... So it completely changed. I mean, and that's so interesting, isn't it? And I think, again, if you're in a relationship for long enough, your lives are going to change. And the relationship is going to obviously change in really profound ways. So that's right. Yeah. And then they had the sort of challenge of being a kind of celebrity couple and the pressures that brought to the marriage, which were different from the pressures of being an ostracised couple who couldn't be invited out to dinner together.
Because in the early stages that would be perhaps quite a bonding thing, because the world is against you.
In a way,
whereas it might produce new
yes.
challenges. The celebrity status produces
Of course.
increasing
And
challenges.
particularly with jealousy. I mean, she suddenly has all these admirers, you know, who are sort of, and I think that theme of jealousy and other possibilities really comes out in the Middlemarch. I think that's coming from the experience. Suddenly she's got Johnny Cross and Edith. Edith Simcoe. Okay, she's got all these other people who are kind of vying for her attention, and she starts, you know, and of course she ends up marrying one, doesn't she? But yeah, so it really changes it.
I just want to say, Clare, I love, thank you so much for the talk. I loved your emphasis on marriage as a kind of micro world within which, crucially, the two partners are going to either flourish or die, or it's going to determine their life.
Yes.
Like sort of whole new.
Yeah.
And I wondered, what inspired you to go in that, was it your own marriage that inspired your thoughtfulness about all this? I don't mean that, I really don't mean that. I know what we're married, so I answer in full confidence.
I think my own experience figured in that I felt like being married was really important to me, and I was interested in that in a sort of post-feminist context. You know, why does marriage matter so much? You know, because you could have a sort of rational view that said, oh, it's just a piece of paper, and you know, it's this institution that's all suppressed women. You know, there's all these reasons to kind of reject marriage, but those didn't affect me at all. On an emotional level, being married was important, so it was really important to me not just to be with my husband, but to be married with him. But actually, what I found through writing the book, which I didn't think about at all until the end, it's often the way, is how my experience of my own parents' marriage had shaped my interest. Because there's something about being a child and you're inside this marriage, and so in a way you're really close to it, but it's also very mysterious. Like you don't really know what's going on in the bedroom when they're alone together. It's almost a sort of taboo sort of space. It's something you can't enter into, and yet it's so close to you and it affects you in such profound ways. And in a way I saw a kind of parallel with this, that and I still don't really understand the truth of my own parents' marriage, partly because my mum died when I was quite young, so I can't ask her anymore about what her experience was, but I always wonder about it. So almost thinking about, here's another marriage that George Eliot and neuroscience that presents itself as very happy, as my parents' marriage did. And then as I told you, I sort of realised that it wasn't actually as happy as it was portrayed. And so this was another marriage that sort of had the surface of being very happy, but actually inside, you know, it was much more complicated than that, and there were sufferings and trials that couldn't really be expressed and talked about. And so I almost had that sense of the sort of child's curiosity about this marriage. And but as I said, it was only towards the end of writing the book that I suddenly realised it was one of those things like, oh gosh, of course, that really mirrors that sense of the mystery of my own parents' marriage. Because George Eliot's marriage is still a mystery, even though I've had a go at exploring it. And yeah, so that's another interesting angle of the marriage question, the way we all kind of grow up with.
And the whole theme of dependence.
Yes.
I think that's what I remember you talking about when we went on the tour, was how, in a way, you relished your feeling of dependence, not as something to be ashamed of as a woman. And that really interested me.
Yes.
And it need not be weak.
Exactly, and I think that really comes out of George. I think that was her philosophy too. So it goes back to what I was saying about feminism. And there's almost this sort of idea that you should be an independent woman, you should be autonomous, making all your own decisions, not dependent emotionally or financially on your husband. And as you say, my experience, emotionally extremely dependent on this relationship, and I think most of us are dependent on the relationships we're in. And actually it's very Spinozist idea that we're all interconnected. We're not kind of isolated selves who don't kind of have relationships, that our relationships completely form us kind of from the ground up. There's no bit of us that's autonomous and self-sufficient. And I think George Eliot, through her work on Spinoza, really kind of, in a deep way, imbibed that sense of interdependence, certainly human interdependence, but also the way we're dependent on all the kinds of, on nature, on all the kinds of forms of life that we live in. She has a metaphor of the web in Middlemarch. Everything is interconnected, and so of course everything is interdependent. And to really flourish and be strong and free is not to kind of cut yourself off from those ties, but to really gain understanding and sympathy in those relationships, in that interdependence. And that's her vision, which is, as I say, in a way a bit different from the kind of maybe more superficial feminist visions that I kind of, in a way, grew up with and encountered. So I was really interested in exploring that, as you say.
Thank you, Claire. I'm sorry to be on for long, but we must draw a halt because of time. But it's been a wonderful, fascinating, wonderful start to the day, hasn't it? So, sincere thanks to you, Claire. Lots of conversations to carry on later on in the day. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much.
Quick 10-minute break if you want to stretch your legs.